All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're taking on a topic that you might think is all about knights and shining armor and damsels in distress. Chivalry.
Yeah, it's got that reputation for sure.
Oh, we're going to go a lot deeper than that, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're going to really unpack all the complexities of chivalry. And thankfully, you've got some amazing sources for us to dive into.
Yes, I do. We've got excerpts from medieval-life.net. We're going to be looking at a chapter from a history textbook. And
Right.
we even have a scholarly article that connects chivalry to modern laws of war. So,
Wow, that's quite a range.
yeah, we're covering a lot of ground. So let's start with, I guess, kind of like the basics. What exactly is chivalry?
Yeah, great question.
It's more than just, rescuing damsels, right?
You got it. I mean, it did start with those mounted warriors. Like the word chivalry itself, it actually evolved from terms that basically meant like horse warrior.
Okay.
But it definitely evolved over time into something way more complex, like a whole code of conduct that extended beyond the battlefield and into everyday life.
So it became like this, code of behavior.
Yeah.
What were like some of the key virtues of chivalry? Um, I imagine bravery was a big one.
Bravery, yeah, super important. But the list actually goes on and on. You've got prowess, justice, loyalty, defense, courage, faith. It's pretty extensive.
Wow, that's a lot to live up to.
It is. And what's really interesting is how those virtues, they were meant to kind of work together.
Okay.
It wasn't just about being like a really skilled fighter. You had to be a just person, a compassionate person.
So like the whole package.
Exactly.
Are there any virtues out of that whole list that you find particularly surprising?
Ooh, surprising.
Yeah, or like unexpected. For someone like me who kind of mainly associates chivalry with, swords and armor.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, one that always kind of stands out to me is largesse.
Largesse, what's that?
It basically meant being generous,
Yeah.
especially with your resources.
Okay.
And, in a feudal society where there was such a rigid class system, that generosity towards those less fortunate, it was a really big deal. So, like, medieval philanthropy.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And then there's another one, franchise. It meant like embodying the chivalric code so well that others felt compelled to follow your example.
Okay, so it's about, like, leading by example.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, it's still relevant today.
Absolutely. Still important.
And you can't talk about chivalry without mentioning the whole, like, honoring and serving ladies aspect. Was that really how it played out in the real world?
Well, you know how things can get a little romanticized over time?
Yeah.
While I'm sure some knights genuinely tried to live up to that ideal, the reality for a lot of women in feudal society, especially those not born into nobility, was much harsher.
Oh, I see. So those stories we hear about, like, gallant knights sweeping ladies off their feet,
Right.
maybe not the full picture.
Exactly. Actually, later on, we're going to be looking at some primary sources that shed light on the very different experiences of noble women and peasant women.
Ooh, that'll be interesting. So how did the whole concept of chivalry change over time? Yeah, that's a great question.
Because obviously, the world of knights and castles didn't last forever.
It did not. No, chivalry was constantly evolving to reflect changing social and economic realities. Like, take the 10 Commandments of chivalry that were written in the 13th century.
Okay.
Some of those commandments are very specific to that time period, like, waging war against non-Christians without mercy.
Yeah. I don't think that would fly today.
Definitely not. It shows how chivalry was really intertwined with the religious and political landscape of the time.
Right.
But despite those shifts, the core principles of chivalry, they've proven to be pretty adaptable. They evolved to fit these new realities, while still supporting the defense of what was considered right.
Okay, so how do those chivalric values play out in the 21st century? I mean, could they even be applied to, like, the dilemmas we face today?
Oh, that's a great question. It's definitely something worth exploring. I mean, even today, we're still grappling with things like justice and loyalty and courage, and maybe, looking back at how these virtues were understood in the past can offer some fresh perspectives on navigating our own pretty complex world.
Yeah, I like that. Looking to the past to inform the present.
Okay.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about, like, the practical side of knighthood.
Okay.
How do these, like, young men actually become knights?
Yeah.
Is it like an apprenticeship?
I mean, you could say that. They would start their training around the age of 7 as a page. They'd live in a lord's castle, learning basic fighting skills, etiquette.
7 years old. That's pretty young to be sent away from home to train to be a knight.
It was intense, and it wasn't all, swordplay and jousting right away. They had to learn humility through tasks like waiting on tables, cleaning armor, observing their elders.
Right.
It was a long process of learning and proving themselves.
So, sounds like patience was another important virtue even back then.
Oh, absolutely. And then around 14, they would become a squire, basically a knight's assistant.
Okay.
Imagine helping with armor, caring for horses, even accompanying the knight into battle, all while still training.
Wow. I can't even imagine, like, being in battle at 14.
Talk about a trial by fire, right? And then finally, around 21, if they had proven themselves worthy, they would be formally dubbed a knight in a grand ceremony.
So achieving knighthood must have been a huge honor.
Oh, yeah.
What did it actually mean to be a knight in feudal society?
Well, they held a very special place. They were warriors, protectors, but they also had specific obligations. They were granted land, which was called a fief, in exchange for providing military service to their lord.
So it was a job as much as a social status.
Exactly. And being a knight required significant resources. Maintaining their equipment, their horses, even their squires, it wasn't cheap. And remember, their lord could call upon them to fight at any time.
It's a lot more responsibility than just, riding around looking for dragons to slay.
That's right.
Speaking of fighting, didn't knights also participate in tournaments?
They did.
Were those as, glamorous as they're often portrayed?
Tournaments. They were definitely a spectacle, crowds, ladies watching from the stands. But they were still very dangerous competitions. Knights could get seriously injured or even killed.
So maybe not as romantic as the stories make them out to be.
Let's just say they were a bit more rough and tumble than a Renaissance fair. They were a chance for knights to show off their skills, maybe win some prizes. But also, a pretty stark reminder of the ever-present danger they face.
Right. It's a good segue to our next point, the reality of medieval warfare.
Okay.
And those history books, they don't sugarcoat how brutal it was, especially sieges.
No, you don't.
Can you imagine being trapped inside a castle while an army is, bombarding you with all kinds of terrifying contractions?
It's hard to even fathom battering rams, siege towers, and those terrifying trebuchets launching giant rocks at the castle walls.
Yeah. And it wasn't just rocks, right? Our textbook mentioned some pretty gruesome examples.
Oh, yes. They would fling anything they could get their hands on. Burning lime, diseased cows, even severed human heads.
Oh, my God.
Psychological warfare at its finest. It really highlights the brutality of medieval combat, which, stands in such stark contrast to the romanticized image of chivalry.
It makes you wonder how all that violence coexisted with, ideals of honor and virtue.
It's a fascinating paradox, for sure. Chivalry might have offered a code of conduct, but it definitely didn't erase the inherent brutality of war.
So much tension there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that's actually reflected in medieval literature,
Okay.
which often grappled with this very task, reconciling the violence of war with these chivalric ideals.
Trying to make sense of it all.
Exactly. And that's where epic poetry comes in. Stories about legendary heroes like King Arthur and Charlemagne, they became incredibly popular during this time.
Ah, those classic tales of bravery and adventure. I actually remember reading the Song of Roland in school. It was so dramatic.
Perfect example. These epic poems, they often glorified knights and battles, presenting them as noble struggles between good and evil.
Right, right. And they often featured, these larger-than-life characters.
Yes.
Who just, embodied chivalric ideals.
Absolutely. Like Turpin the Archbishop in the Song of Roland, there's this very memorable quote where he rallies the French troops, urging them to fight bravely for their king and faith.
Oh, wow.
It's a very powerful portrayal of courage and piety in the face of, overwhelming odds.
Yeah. It's like they were trying to find meaning and purpose amidst the chaos of war.
Exactly. And it wasn't just epic poems. Think about the troubadours, those wandering musicians who, popularized the idea of courtly love.
Oh, yeah. They were all about serenading ladies with songs of devotion and admiration.
Yeah, exactly. And their songs often portrayed noble women as these beautiful, virtuous figures worthy of a knight's, undying love. It fed into this whole romanticized vision of chivalry. Knights performing heroic deeds in the name of their beloved.
Sounds pretty dreamy. But wasn't the reality for most medieval women a lot different from those idealized portrayals?
You are absolutely right. While those troubadour songs might have painted a very rosy picture, the reality for most women, especially those outside the nobility, was far more constrained. Remember those primary forces we talked about earlier?
The ones about noble women and peasant women.
Exactly. They give us a glimpse into the very different experiences of women in feudal society. While noble women might have enjoyed certain privileges, their lives were still largely dictated by the men in their families.
And peasant women, I imagine, had even fewer options.
Unfortunately, yes. They were often burdened with, back-breaking labor in the fields, at home, bearing and raising children, and generally struggling to make ends meet. Their lives were a far cry from the romantic ideals celebrated in those courtly love songs.
Yeah, definitely a different picture. It's a good reminder that the romantic image of chivalry often kind of obscured the realities of life for a lot of people in the Middle Ages.
Absolutely. It's so important to examine those primary sources, the
Yeah.
ones that give voice to those who are often marginalized or overlooked in the grand narratives of history.
Right. Okay. So we've talked about the military side of chivalry, the cultural impact, the romantic ideal. But there's one more piece of the puzzle that I'm really curious about, this like surprising link between chivalry and the laws of war.
Oh, yeah.
It's not something you usually think about together.
Right. It's fascinating. That scholarly article you shared really opened my eyes to that connection. It argues that some of the key principles of chivalry actually laid the groundwork for the modern laws of war we have today.
So you're saying that those ancient codes of conduct, the ones knights followed centuries ago, actually influenced how wars are fought today.
That's the argument. And it's pretty compelling. Think about, for example, the prohibition of perfidy,
Perfidy, okay.
which means using deception to gain an advantage in combat. It was something knights considered dishonorable, and that same principle is now actually enshrined in international law.
Wow, that's interesting. And what about those rules about, like, respecting flags of truce or treating prisoners of war humanely? Those seem to have, like, direct connections to chivalric ideals as well.
Exactly. The article gives several great examples. Remember how we talked about knights not attacking an opponent who had surrendered? That concept, known as giving quarter, is now a cornerstone of international humanitarian law.
It's amazing to see how those ancient principles are still relevant in modern times. It's like chivalry is this thread connecting us back to the past, but also shaping the future. But I have to ask, can chivalry really be relevant in a world that's so different from the Middle Ages? We're not fighting wars on horseback anymore.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the article presents arguments both for and against the relevance of chivalry in modern warfare.
So it's not a simple answer.
Not at all. It's a very complex issue, especially with the rise of asymmetric warfare.
Right. When you're dealing with non-state actors who might not follow any kind of established code of conduct, like, does chivalry even apply?
It's a tough one. The article does point out that this type of warfare creates real challenges for applying those traditional notions of chivalry. But at the same time, it argues that there are still compelling reasons to uphold those ideals, even today.
Oh, okay. What kind of reasons?
Well, for one thing, maintaining a moral high ground can have a significant impact on how the international community perceives a nation.
So even if, like, your enemy isn't playing by the rules, it's still advantageous for you to do so.
Precisely. Plus, upholding those standards can have a positive impact on troop morale and discipline.
It's almost like those chivalric virtues, they can actually contribute to a military's effectiveness.
That's the argument. It's about finding that balance between, upholding those honorable ideals and confronting the realities of modern warfare.
Definitely gives us a lot to think about. And I think we've covered quite a bit of ground in this first part of our deep dive. Why don't we take a moment to let all of that sink in before we continue our exploration of chivalry? We'll be back in just a bit to delve even deeper into this topic.
It is a lot to think about. I mean, we've gone from the origins of knights to the complexities of modern warfare.
And we're not done yet.
Not even close. There's still so much to uncover about chivalry.
So where should we go next on our chivalric journey?
Well, we've talked a lot about how brutal medieval warfare could be. But, chivalry wasn't just about fighting. It was this whole cultural phenomenon that had a huge impact on art, literature, even love.
Oh, yeah. The romantic side of chivalry, something that, still captures our imaginations today.
Absolutely. And you can really see that reflected in medieval literature. You mentioned the Song of Roland earlier, which is a perfect example
Yeah.
of an epic poem that glorifies chivalry and heroism.
Yeah, I remember it being full of like these larger than life characters who like embodied those chivalric ideals.
Exactly. Like take Turpin the Archbishop, for instance.
Okay.
He's not just a religious figure. He's also a warrior who fights right alongside the knights. And there's this one passage where he's rallying the French troops, urging them to fight bravely for their king and faith.
Wow.
And it really exemplifies that fusion of piety and martial prowess that was so central to the chivalric ideal.
Yeah. Like they were trying to find a way to like make sense of the violence of war by imbuing it with a higher purpose.
That is such an insightful observation. And it wasn't just epic poems. Think about the troubadours,
Okay.
those wandering musicians who basically popularized the idea of courtly love.
Oh, yeah. Those guys.
Yeah.
All about serenading ladies with songs of devotion and admiration.
Exactly. And their songs often portrayed noblewomen as these, like, beautiful and virtuous figures, worthy of a knight's, undying love. And
Yeah.
it really fed into this whole romanticized vision of chivalry, where knights would perform heroic deeds in the name of their beloved.
Ah, so romantic. But wasn't the reality for most medieval women quite a bit different from those idealized portrayals?
You're absolutely right. While those troubadour songs might have painted a very rosy picture, the reality for most women, especially those outside the nobility, was much more constrained. Remember those primary sources we talked about earlier?
The ones about noble women and peasant women.
Exactly. Those sources offer a really valuable glimpse into the very different experiences of women in feudal society. While noble women might have enjoyed certain privileges, their lives were still largely dictated by, the men in their families.
And peasant women, I'm guessing, had even fewer options.
Unfortunately, yes. They were often burdened with, backbreaking labor, both in the fields and at home, bearing and raising children, and, generally struggling to make ends meet. Their lives were a far cry from the romantic ideals celebrated in those courtly love songs.
Yeah, definitely a different reality. It's a good reminder that the romantic image of chivalry often obscured the realities of life for a lot of people in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, it's such a valuable point. It really highlights the importance of examining those primary sources. The ones that give voice to the people who are often marginalized or overlooked in those grand narratives of history.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about the military side of chivalry, the cultural impact, the romantic ideal, but there's one more piece of the puzzle that I'm, like, really curious about. And that's this kind of surprising link between chivalry and the laws of war.
Oh, yes.
I mean, it's not something you usually think about together.
I know. It's so fascinating, right? That scholarly article you shared, it really opened my eyes to that connection. The article argues that some of the key principles of chivalry actually laid the groundwork for the modern laws of war that we have today.
So you're saying that those ancient codes of conduct, like the ones knights followed centuries ago, they've actually influenced how wars are fought today.
That's exactly what the article is arguing, and it's pretty compelling. Like, think about the prohibition of perfidy.
Perfidy, okay.
Which means using deception to gain an advantage in combat. It was something knights considered very dishonorable, and that same principle is now actually enshrined in international law.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And what about those rules about, like, respecting flags of truce or treating prisoners of war humanely? Those seem to have, like, pretty direct connections to chivalric ideals.
Exactly. The article highlights several examples like that. Like, remember how we discussed the concept of giving quarter,
Yeah.
where knights were expected to spare a defeated opponent who had surrendered? Well, that concept is now a fundamental principle of international humanitarian law.
That's really remarkable to see how these, like, ancient principles are still relevant in the modern world. It's like chivalry is this thread connecting us back to the past, but also shaping the future.
I love that. Yeah.
But I do have to ask, can chivalry really be relevant in a world that's so different from the Middle Ages? I mean, we're not fighting wars on horseback anymore.
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the article does a great job of presenting arguments, both for and against the relevance of chivalry in modern warfare.
It's not a simple answer.
No, not at all. It's a
Yeah.
really complex issue, especially with the rise of what's called asymmetric warfare.
Oh, right. When you're dealing with, like, non-state actors who might not follow any kind of, like, established code of conduct, does chivalry even apply in those situations?
It's a tough one. The article acknowledges that the changing nature of warfare, it does create real challenges for applying those more traditional notions of chivalry. But at the same time, it argues that there are still really compelling reasons to uphold those ideals, even today.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What kind of reasons?
Well, one of the key arguments is that even if your opponent isn't playing by the rules, it's still in your best interest to maintain that moral high ground.
So even if, like, the other side isn't being chivalrous, you should still strive to be.
Exactly. It's about setting an example and upholding those values even in the face of adversity. And, there can actually be some very practical benefits to that approach.
Oh, like what?
Well, for one thing, it can have a really positive impact on how the international community perceives your actions.
Oh, okay, I see.
And it can also boost morale and discipline, within your own ranks.
So it's like chivalry can actually be a strategic advantage.
That's the argument. It's all about finding that balance between, upholding those honorable ideals and confronting the realities of modern warfare.
It is a lot to unpack, for sure.
Yeah.
You know what? I think my brain is getting a little overloaded here.
Yeah.
We've given our listener plenty to ponder.
I agree.
So why don't we take a little break here, let all this information sink in,
Yeah, good idea.
and then we'll come back for the final part of our deep dive into the world of chivalry. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into chivalry. Hopefully everyone's had a moment to let all that information sink in.
Yeah, it's quite a lot to process.
It really is. I mean, it seems like such a simple concept at first, knights in shining armor.
Right.
But it gets more and more fascinating the more you really dig into it.
Absolutely. We've only just scratched the surface, really.
It feels like it, yeah. So, we've talked about the history of chivalry, the myths, the realities, even the potential relevance of it in today's world.
Yeah.
Where do we go from here? Like, what's the takeaway for our listener?
Well, I think, one of the most important takeaways is that chivalry, it wasn't just about, like, knights in shining armor or those big romantic gestures.
Right.
It was, at its core, it was a code of conduct.
Yeah.
It was a set of values that really guided people's actions and their interactions with others.
And some of those values, like, courage, justice, loyalty, I mean, those are still incredibly relevant today.
Oh, absolutely.
Even though we don't, live in a world of castles and jousting tournaments.
That's right. We don't. But that's what I find so fascinating about chivalry is this idea that it can be, more than just a historical curiosity.
Right.
It can actually be a source of inspiration, like a framework for thinking about how we want to live our lives, how we engage with the world around us.
So you're saying that we can all be a little bit chivalrous, even if we're not, literally wielding swords or rescuing damsels in distress.
Exactly. It's about taking those core principles of chivalry, like integrity, compassion, respect, courage, and finding ways to express those in our own lives.
Okay. So it's not about, like, putting on a suit of armor.
No.
But it's about embodying those virtues in our everyday actions.
Yeah. Just think about, what would it look like to bring a little more honor, fairness, respect to our everyday interactions? How can we be more courageous, standing up for what we believe in, or more compassionate in dealing with others?
Yeah, it's like almost like a personal challenge to kind of bring that chivalric spirit into the modern world.
I like that. And who knows, maybe by embracing those values, we can actually make the world a slightly better place.
A little more just, a little more honorable.
Exactly.
It's definitely something to think about. So, dear listener, we leave you with this final thought. How can you incorporate a little more chivalry into your own life?
Yeah.
What would your personal code of chivalry look like?
It's a really great question to consider. And as you, continue on your own journey of exploration, may you always find the courage to be kind, the strength to be just, and the wisdom to make the world a little bit brighter.
That's a beautiful sentiment. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of chivalry. And until next time, may your quest be filled with purpose, your hearts with courage, and your lives with honor.